but they were walking around like listening to the, like the nighttime, like kind of creature and bug sounds and like testing it. And I'm like, this is surreal, like just the nerdiest. I'm so fortunate to have had that experience. And like I get to carry that with me anytime I go to Galaxy's Edge and remember it.
That is author Amy Ratcliffe, and you're listening to the Tomorrow Society podcast. Hey there, thanks for joining me here on this episode of the Tomorrow Society podcast. I'm your host, Dan Heaton. Really excited as both a Star Wars and theme park fan to talk with Amy Ratcliffe. I've been following her work for a really long time. She has written so many cool books, including The Art of Star Wars Galaxy's Edge, Star Wars Women of the Galaxy, and her upcoming book, Thrill Ride. We're going to talk about all of those on the show. But beyond that, what I really enjoyed is just geeking out a little bit and talking about Star Wars and what's happening right now and what we wish was in Galaxy's Edge. Just a lot of fun theme park and Star Wars talk here with Amy, who's done so many cool books, also has hosted podcasts, been at Star Wars Celebration. Just has a really smart perspective on the fandom and the shows and, of course, the parks. So let's dive right into it. Here is Amy Ratcliffe. Well, I'm really excited to talk with today's guest. She's an author who's written so many cool books about Star Wars, Marvel, fandom, and more, including The Art of Star Wars Galaxy's Edge, which I can't recommend highly enough. Her upcoming book, Thrill Ride, is an adult rom-com set in a small-town theme park that will be released next spring. It is Amy Ratcliffe. Amy, thank you so much for talking with me on the podcast.
Dan, thank you for asking me. I was excited to get your email. I don't get to talk about, I haven't been on a podcast in a second, so I feel like I haven't talked about Star Wars or theme parks enough in my life recently.
Well, that's good. I'm glad to provide that service, to help out. But yeah, no, I've been following your work for a while, and especially when you wrote the book about, you had Galaxy's Edge, that book's incredible. But also just there's a lot more going on as me personally being a Star Wars fan and just a lot of crossover with fandoms. But I'd love to start even before we dive into your books with just your background, especially as a Star Wars fan, but how you originally became a fan of Star Wars, but just in general, kind of how you got started with fandom, I guess.
Yeah. So I think fandom, looking back, it was when I was a teenager and I was really into fantasy books, courtesy of my high school boyfriend. And I got into The Wheel of Time, which is a fantasy series by Robert Jordan and later Brandon Sanderson. And I didn't know the word fandom then, but looking back, I'm like, my friend of my mom's had just got dial-up internet. So that was exciting. And I would go to her place specifically to visit a site called WOT Mania to visit the forum and a different site for fans of that book series called Tarvalon.net, where you would like role play as an Aes Sedai, which are kind of the magic users of the world. And I was like hardcore into fan theories because those books came out, I don't think quite as slowly as A Song of Ice and Fire by George R. R. Martin, but pretty slowly. So looking back, I'm like, okay, that was my first fandom. Like I would get a t-shirt from the site. I wore that when I went to a signing with the author. So I didn't know the word back then. But I'm like, that's fandom 100%.
Well, how did Star Wars come into the picture for you? Because for me, it came in very early. I grew up in the 80s when I saw Jedi in the theater and stuff. But then there was all that time where I just watched the trilogy forever. But I think it was a little different for you when you jumped in, was more a bit later.
Yeah, I'm a late bloomer with Star Wars for sure. So I also, thanks to my high school boyfriend, thanks Josh, saw the special editions when they came to the theaters in 97. And that was my first experience with the movies. Thinking back, my first experience with Star Wars was actually writing Star Tours at Disneyland in 1991, though I didn't really have context for what it was, except that there were cute teddy bear creatures. But what really got me into Star Wars fandom was fast forward almost a decade later in Clone Wars, and something about Star Wars: The Clone Wars, specifically the Clone Wars, not Clone Wars, the Genndy Tartakovsky one. Though I love that, but I didn't see it till later. But something about that time period, I had liked the prequels, um, but getting more into that era, seeing more of Anakin as an actual hero, and Ahsoka is my favorite fictional character ever. So meeting that Padawan who was so sassy and just a total brat sometimes, and seeing more of Obi-Wan, and that just like scratched an itch I didn't know I had for Star Wars, I guess. And it made me revisit everything. It's why I started blog and how I started kind of my writing, what has become my writing career was because of loving the Clone Wars so much. And I still like, I love all of Star Wars, but when I think about some of my favorite moments, it's from the Clone Wars or from Star Wars Rebels. Like even the most recent season of the Bad Batch or the final season was phenomenal. So it really animated series is what pulled me in, and it's been a wonderful downhill slope ever since.
Well, I'm curious. You mentioned Ahsoka because we just had last year Ahsoka with characters.
That was last year.
I know. I wrote this up. I'm like, wasn't that like April? It's like no, it was last year
a
because
year
Bad
ago.
Batch was this year. You have Rosario Dawson playing Ahsoka from The Mandalorian, and then Ahsoka, and then you have like Sabine and Ezra Bridger and Thrawn and everybody. I mean, what was it like to see them live action after seeing these characters on Rebels and other shows?
It was wild. And I remember telling whatever the most recent Star Wars celebration was, I don't remember anymore. London, whatever one, I was talking to Dave Filoni because I was moderating the Clone Wars like 15th anniversary panel, and we were talking about Rebels. And at that time, I'm sorry, Ahsoka. At that time, we just seen trailers and stuff. But I'm like, I feel like it's like watching my babies like come to life on screen. And I'm like, and he was like, yeah. And I'm like, well, yeah, even more for you because they are your babies. But it was surreal and really fun to see how like Imanis Fondi, like his Ezra, I'm like, with these little nuances, I'm like, you are this animated character in a way that's like beautiful, but also like how? Because you're a talented actor, is how. But all of them seeing their interpretation and seeing them like bring their own things to the character while seeing like the familiar traits that I know and love about all of them. It was really cool. And I think the only thing that threw me, especially with Ezra and Hera, like their contacts were just so very blue. Like that's an animated trait that I'm like, I think you could have translated that a little more for, like in a not so true to screen manner. But
Yeah, when you move to live action, it's like, how much do we go full, with the makeup and everything, or do we make it a little less intense? Yeah, because I mean, Mandalorian started out, I feel like the first season was like this kind of pulpy show, and they had these one-off episodes. And then the second season, they're like, okay, we're just going to start bringing characters from all these shows. And it built the world, which is still crazy to me.
gosh, was it second season of When did we get Cad Bane live action? Because that, like, I
Oh,
lost my mind over that. But was that Book of Boba
that was
Fett, or
Boba
was it?
Fett, wasn't it? Because Cobb Vanth, oh my gosh, we're already going up. But Cobb Vanth showed up in The Mandalorian and then came back. And then I think Cad Bane was in Boba Fett, if I'm thinking correctly.
I
But
think you're right. They do
yeah.
run together. But that was a live action to like character to live action. I'm like, I thought I was like, I don't know if you're going to pull that off. And they did.
Well, switching back to your when you became a writer, you referenced that. I'd love to know how, because a lot of us, like including myself, are fans and everything, but actually converting that into a career versus even doing it as a hobby, which I know you were also doing. How did that kind of evolve where you were blogging and then kind of went from there?
Yeah, it was a time, it happened over time for sure. And went from, I made so many connections. Twitter was a different world back in
Yes.
2009, as we well know. That I was just, in my little corner with my blog talking about being a nerd and talking about it from a female perspective. And at that time, I didn't know a lot of I know that female geeks have always been a thing, but I didn't know a lot of other ones in real life. And then I did because of that blog and because of Twitter. And because of Twitter, I also met editors who, like from IGN and Matt Martin from Lucasfilm, who at that time, he's now part of Story Group, but at that time, he was kind of overseeing their .com presence. And I had started picking up paying work here and there. And I met Matt at Celebration, who knows which, six maybe. And it was very fun. Like I had to really push myself. I'm still shy and still an introvert, but I was super like shy then. And I was like, you got to go talk to him and be like, let me write for StarWars.com. And that worked out. And I started doing, what did I start doing for StarWars.com? I think it was like fan spotlights, like on the 501st or cosplayers or people making just cool things. And Slowly but surely, that led to Star Wars Insider magazine, which is the officially licensed magazine for Lucasfilm. So in 2017, my editor for Women of the Galaxy reached out. He's with Chronicle Books, which is the publisher for that book, and asked if I would be interested in writing this potential Star Wars book, which was like a very surreal email to get. At that point, that was like my dream, right? I want to write a Star Wars book. He had been given my name by someone at Lucasfilm. I think that was from, I'd been writing not, for StarWars.com and Insider, but on the publicity side too, I'd been working with the publicist for Clone Wars for years, and also the kind of been in the same circle as the publishing team for a while because I wrote about Star Wars books and hailed them, and I was just very, very in that world and very loud about it in a way that I'm like, oh, present day Amy would not have the energy for that because I try to be online less and less. But that's kind of how it came about. And then Women of the Galaxy, like I had to do writing samples, of course. That was published in 2018. And it's, I think, as an author or a creative type, you think this is going to be it. No one's ever going to hire me again. Unfortunately, I have continued to get hired for things, which is the goal.
Oh yeah, and I should spotlight Women of the Galaxy is a really cool book. With the art from like you have a bunch of female and non-binary artists that are doing the art, which is really, I mean, that's as much as the art is stunning along with your writing. I don't mean to downplay your writing.
No, downplay, because the art is gorgeous. Like truly, if you never read a word in that book, pick it up and look at the art because it's stunning.
Let me ask you about that though, because I mean, you narrow it down to, I mean, there's a lot of characters. It's not that narrow, but how did you go about deciding how to present those characters? Because you have a fairly limited amount of text for each one because you're trying to get a lot of them into the book.
Yes. So we had 75 female characters, and we wanted to make sure something Lucasfilm was very much pushing for it, and myself as well, like not just from the animated series or the films. Like we want to talk about video games, and we wanted comics and publishing because that's such a part of the Star Wars story. And going back in time, I can't remember some of the ones we cut now, but I know like Charbet was on our short list and didn't make it in. That's a Resistance, a Rebel Alliance fighter in Resistance, and also Poe Dameron's mother. And it was challenging. And then, like, we wanted to put characters in like Beru Lars, who at that time, it was before the Obi-Wan Kenobi series, well before then. So, did we have the most to say? I'm like, I have to write how many words about it? Because I have 2 sentences. Sorry, Beru. Because we, are relying strictly on canonical information. So, and then you get someone like Leia, where I'd be like, I could do half of this book could be Leia. And it was really trying to blend, okay, like we didn't want to just be like a Wikipedia entry, right? Though I love Wikipedia. It is very, very helpful for research, but we wanted to like have some personal kind of essay bits to it or some behind the scenes. So it was really such a learning experience for my first book and such a delight. And I will say that if enterprising individuals or to believe things they saw on the internet, that possibly there might be a Women of the Galaxy thing happening next spring that I can either confirm or deny.
Interesting. I like that. Well, speaking of trying to find a way to get a lot of information out there, let's talk about the art of Star Wars Galaxy's Edge. But before we did that,
Yes, my cat also named Ahsoka. She's like, excuse me.
Well, I got distracted by the cuteness there. I think I'll keep that in the audio, just me getting distracted here. But before we even talk about the book itself, you referenced that you wrote Star Tours. Of course, there was the original version with Paul Rubens and Rex and everything in 1991. But I'm curious, a little bit about your background just with theme parks in general, because I know you're a fan and just going there, not just for Star Tours, but beyond Galaxy's Edge.
Yeah. So once, I moved to LA in 2007 from Ohio, which is where I grew up. And previous to then, I'd been to Disneyland once and been to Disney World a couple times. And otherwise, in Ohio, we had Cedar Point, which I'm not a roller coaster person, never have been, and Kings Island. But Cedar Point had Berenstain Bears Land when I was a kid. And I thought that was the coolest. But fast forward to 2007, I moved out to LA, and the person I was dating at the time like loved Disneyland and kind of introduced me to this concept of annual passes, and that you can just have an annual pass, and especially back then, like,
oh yeah,
it wasn't as like bustling, and you could just like go for a few hours. And so I very quickly became a pass holder. and got to know Disneyland. That's when I really got into knowing, like learning about Imagineering and learning more about Walt Disney's history specifically and how that park came to be. And that was a delightful rabbit hole and just a way that I spent, gosh, so many weeks, so lucky to spend just so many weekends, like just hopping down on a Saturday for a while. And then when Star Tours: The Adventures Continue opened, which was 2011 or 2012,
I think 2011, yeah.
I went on opening day and went. I think I had to get done with work and then driving down to Disneyland and to Anaheim from the Valley, which is where I lived on a Friday evening, or Friday afternoon, was a choice that I made. But after hours in the car, we got there and then spent hours in line. And I remember a few things specifically. One is that Sam Witwer was in line ahead of us, and that was, he plays the main character in The Force Unleashed. He voices that character, the video game, and the character was modeled on him. But then, more importantly, later he voiced the son in the Clone Wars and the Mortis trilogy, and then later Darth Maul. And because I was like, why is Sam Witwer having to wait? Because it was like 3 to 4 hours that I waited, which is not something I do often at theme parks because I'm impatient and have a small bladder. And then the ride, like that was such a cool experience. I'm so glad I did it and to check out the ride. And then afterwards, I remember telling Sam Witwer, like, I don't often do this, but I loved him as the son so much. I was like, oh, like, you're so great in the Clone Wars. And he was kind of like sneakily said, like, oh, I might have more coming up. And that was before Darth Maul. And I was like, oh. Anyway, yeah, so I miss that, I live in North Carolina now and I love it, but I miss being within close driving distance to a Disney theme park for sure. And I really was just getting into my Universal Studios Hollywood era right before the pandemic and right before I moved, because I think that park's really special too.
Oh yeah, I went there for the first time since I was a kid, Universal Hollywood last year, and was like, man, the tour and just
the tram tour.
So much of it though, a lot of the kind of cool shows like the horror and makeup and stuff are gone, but the tram tour is still so good.
When I heard the animal actors was being taken out for, I think, a Fast and the Furious,
yes.
Which is not my fandom. I'm glad it is for other people. But I was like, no, the animal actors, at least they still have Waterworld.
Yes, which I did see, which was incredible. But I'm jealous that you even had that stretch of time where you lived close, because I'm in the St. Louis, in the middle of the country. So anytime I go to a park, it's like, beyond
a production.
Yeah, it's like, even if it's with my kids or if it's not or whatever, it's just like, well, one, it's so expensive. But regardless of that, let's talk about the book. Let's talk about The Art of Star Wars Galaxy's Edge, because, you referenced Imagineering, and then obviously you have so much background with Lucasfilm and Star Wars. And I feel like it all kind of comes together in this really cool book. So how did you get started doing that? And just getting involved in doing such a cool book, which is not common. Imagineering typically is they're very secretive, as I learned.
Exactly. Yeah. It was such a treat to do the book for that reason. And also because like my Venn diagram like overlaps very much over Star Wars and Disney parks. It definitely contributed is that for a brief period before Galaxy's Edge opened, I contracted with Disney. I worked with Disney in their in-house advertising agency, Yellow Shoes, to kind of be the Star Wars nerd for their advertising campaigns for Galaxy's Edge, because it is unique in that it is a canonical part of the story, right? So it was kind of there to help them to be the liaison between Imagineering and Lucasfilm and Yellow Shoes and try to help them understand like why the story, like you can't say XYZ because it's not part of the story or does not, And because of that, I worked really closely with Scott Trowbridge in Imagineering, who I super look up to and is always very generous with his time. I had a great chat with him about Thrill Ride, in which I'm like, tell me about your budget things I wouldn't know about for theme parks. They really wanted to show off Lucasfilm and Imagineering between them generated, as you can see, like so much art and so many concepts for the land that I think they just really wanted a chance to showcase it. And I'm not sure if Scott gave my name to Lucasfilm or like how that happened, but that was another email I got. We're like, hey, you were recommended. And it felt really special because to that point, the creative art manager at Lucasfilm, Bill Shostak, did the movie Art ofs for Abrams. And I think one other person had written maybe either the Art of Solo or Rogue One. So it felt like I was getting to join a cool club. And really, we started working on it. It was right when the pandemic started. So the upshot of that was like people were at home and very easy to schedule
Yeah.
interviews. But it also meant like my editor for the book and the person who did the layout for the book hadn't been to Galaxy's Edge and couldn't go. And I'm like, don't worry, I got you. I have spent an unreasonable amount of time between being a guest and then, before it opened in Disneyland, I was hanging out there with Yellow Shoes for like 4 or 5 days straight when they were shooting all the B-roll and stuff for their advertising campaign. So it was, I feel very special for having got to spend a lot of time there when it was empty and just wandering around and soaking it in. It was really cool to come in and be like, okay, like I get to help, like at least be like, let's organize, because sometimes with IP books, like for Star Wars, they come to you with like, this is basically the outline and the
Mhm.
chapters that we want. But this one, I feel like I got to be very active in helping decide that stuff. And yeah, then it was just constant nerd out. I think the thing I took away, everyone I talked to from Imagineering and at Lucasfilm, just the enthusiasm and love for Star Wars and the like, we want to do this right for fans. And we are also fans. We want to do it right for ourselves. It was really special.
So I have to ask you even about being at Galaxy's Edge before it opens. So kind of what was that experience like for you before you were doing the book, when you were at Yellow Shoes, like being there when they're shooting this footage, knowing that you're seeing things that pretty much no one has seen so far?
It was so cool. And it was even so in February 2019, I had gone on Disney. I was still at Nerdist then. It was before I went to Disney, and Disney had done a press visit for a small group where we went to Lucasfilm for part of it to have like a talk there with Story Group. And then we came back down to Glendale and went to Imagineering because we saw like it was Florida's Hondo Anaka and Florida's DJ Rex, like the animatronics that they were working on. And then we got to go on the construction site, which knowing back, thinking back on that, and that was February, and then it was ready to open in May. Like the amount of work that they got done in 5 months, I'm like, is bananas. So that was special. And then going back in that week before it opened and one moment in particular I remember is going up inside the TIE Interceptor on the stage where Kylo Ren and
Hmm.
First Order Stormtroopers do their show, and like you can like look out, and it was like just like hitting dusk, so the sun was starting to set, and the sky was beautiful, and I was just like, I had a little bit of a teary eyed moment because I'm like, we are in this land, and it is real, and people are going to come visit it, and it was just kind of like, how did this happen? And that's how I felt walking around the whole thing. And it was really like one night we were shooting late. So like walking around at night and watching, oh my gosh, I'm spacing on who did the sound design now. A movie sound designer who worked with Imagineering, but they were walking around like listening to the, like the nighttime, like kind of creature and bug
Hmm.
sounds and like testing it. And I'm like, this is surreal. Like just the nerdiest. I'm so fortunate to have had that experience. And like I get to carry that with me anytime I go to Galaxy's Edge and remember it.
Oh yeah, you're viewing it differently because you're always having seen it before. Well, you referenced that you had some leeway with the outline and whatever. When you're working with Imagineers like Scott Trowbridge and Margaret Carrison and so many of the other Imagineers, how do you go about working with them where, they're doing so much and then you have to gather info and find a way to put it into like a book structure?
That is a challenge because as I'm sure you're realizing, like I can be a rambler, and in interviews, when I'm conducting them or when I'm moderating a panel, for example, at a convention, my job is to say the least possible and to just prompt a person to get to a memory or to a story. I was so impressed with, by the time I talked to them in 2020, we're talking about things they had been actively working on like years in the past. I love like Margaret Carrison, just like for the story perspective, like talking with her about like all the details that they thought through, whether you encounter them in the land or not, right? It informs the land story. And it was challenging to remember that it was an art of book and not a making of book, because that is a different vibe. But I had so many stories from Margaret, from Scott, from Chris, like, can we do a making of book? Like, I know that's not up to me, but just to as a fan, like I eat that up, right? And I wouldn't be the only one. Like I'm like fans would want to know this, and I can't remember a specific example, of course, now, but it was that is kind of like the a challenge of it is to like let me direct you to like what I need to know. I know it's a little easier once we had layout because I could specifically screen share and be like, this concept art, what do you remember? Or what, like we kind of do it that way. Which is how I've worked on restart of books I've done for Dark Horse Comics. So it was a special one, but it was hard to not fall into the making of, because that was and there's still some of that, right? But it was a beautiful challenge. But at the end of it, I go through when I do interviews like that, I kind of color code them for myself of like by chapter. Sometimes if I'm like, okay, this chapter is about the resistance, these here are quotes in purple from everybody who are about that I could use. And then I mark which ones I have used in a different color. But I bet if I went back through though, there's still like so much I couldn't put, just couldn't fit in the book. So it would not be 500 pages.
It's already pretty packed in just with how everything is. I mean, you mentioned the art. I mean, it's just, I pretty much could just say, okay, let's go through each one and I'll ask you about it. But I would not do that for anyone, especially in the audio medium. But there's like one piece of art where it's like there's a resistance base and there's this giant Star Destroyer behind it. And I was like, oh my gosh. And I know it's like depicting like Rise of the Resistance, the idea that you go through, but I'm like, oh boy. But I'm just curious, not to ask about that one specifically. That's just one example of like hundreds. So, I mean, even with the art, did you have a lot of them you wanted to include that you just didn't have space for?
Yes, they saved, I think Lucasfilm and Imagineering both have pretty robust creative asset systems, and save everything, which is good. Because, if you think back to way back days of yours when they would make props for when ILM was just kind of, in a building in Van Nuys, they'd be like, yeah, we're done with this, whatever piece, we'll just throw it away. And you think back and you're like, oh, wow. That's not the same as digital files, obviously. But there was just a wealth of material to choose from. So even when we would do the loose outline, some of it is like the layout artist, I would be like, okay, let me help, like who hasn't been there, right? The designer be like, okay, these are the images, like this list of file names are relevant to discussing the market. This list of file names is relevant to the resistance, rise of the resistance, and that section. I wish I still had access to that folder. I'm sure I don't. I haven't tried in years, but because there was just so much art, like it was hard for me to wrap my head around. And there would be cases where we kind of like be this or that. And I'd be like, well, my opinion is this. And then we'd also ask Scott or Doug, Scott Trowbridge or Doug Chang, like which ones they thought. Or sometimes they would be like, hey, do you think you have like XYZ piece of art? And I'd be like, that's a great question. And we kind of would have to work backwards to be like, which one? And also, not all of the art file names were obviously credited. So there was kind of some detective work to be like, hey, Phil, or somebody who worked very closely on the asset management, does this style of art look familiar to you? Because it's not signed and it's not in the file name. And we really want to make sure we give credit to the proper person. But I think we got there.
Well, cool. It seems almost, yeah, it's almost like you're investigating while doing the book. You have to do this extra investigation to figure it all out in a way. Well, I had a listener wanted me to ask this question. Now, I will say up front, if you can't answer, I totally understand, but you can be vague. He wanted to know if you saw concepts for the land before they settled on Batu, like art of that. So you don't have, if you can't really say, I understand, but did you see some things that they didn't end up including beyond what was in the book? Or you can answer kind of generally if you need to.
Yes, I did. But more so, I like saw a couple, but it was more like I heard about things that pain me that I can't talk about because I'm like, oh, so yes, but only a little art that I saw. I'm sure more exists, but more that I did hear about other ideas. Yes.
I'm sure it wasn't cool though, right? It was totally
No, it's definitely not anything that I would like super want to do or see.
Well, zipping back to the book a bit, I mean, what interests me too is you see this, like you see the images of the bounty hunters walking around, or the Gungans walking around, or droids, or everything else. As a Star Wars fan, how sad are you that we don't have all of those characters? And I mean, logistically, I don't know how it would even work because they just get mobbed. But I'm curious for you, just like envisioning that world that they kind of you see in the concept art.
I am really bummed. And I think, as a fan of parks and Star Wars, when they first, whichever Bob it was that first started talking about Galaxy's Edge,
I think it was
I think it was
Iger.
Iger,
Yeah.
right? Yeah, I think it was Iger. I'm like, pick a Bob. And it was just like, you have aliens just walking around and droids. And it was just all this hype. And I know I assume budget cuts. I genuinely don't know, but that seems likely. And then it's like, you go in and it's like, well, we have Chewbacca and Rey and Kylo Ren and some stormtroopers. I'm like, that is not enough. And then once they opened Avengers Campus, which I have not seen yet in person, which is a real bummer because I moved during the pandemic. And I know it's not big, but I'm excited because they loaded it with
Oh
characters.
my
And it was
gosh.
like, and characters that change, week to week, depending on what Marvel TV show, like different Lokis for that. And I'm just like, and then over in Galaxy's Edge, they're like, here is a droid here is an R2 unit that is sometimes in the droid depot that we will take slightly outside of the droid depot. And I'm like, I get it, but I feel like I don't know, but I know that with Mando and Baby and Fennec, like it does feel like they're kind of loosening those rules a little about
Yeah.
the canonical stuff, but I'm just like, more characters. And that's not even aliens. Because if Doc Ondar walked around in person, I mean, that animatronic's great, but I would lose but you're right. They would get mobbed.
And it's interesting though because I was there went with Mando and Grogu and stuff, and you get people around like trying to. I have some just awful pictures of like there's the side of Mando's head and me or whatever, but it's not as bad as you think. But I agree for sure. I wish there was more because Avengers Campus. I went there last year, and I felt like every time we walked by, it was like, there's Black Widow. Oh, there's Ant-Man. There's like, it was a different character every time we walked by. And we weren't even, I mean, it wasn't even the special ones. It was, I mean, they set the bar super high there. I wish we could be, yeah, like you said, but even generic aliens would be incredible, I feel like.
Yeah. And I like, where are you using that Rhodian mask from that's no longer in use at Starcruiser? Maybe that could be on a walk around character in the park. I'm just saying.
I have to ask you about the Starcruiser. It's a little bit at the end. You have some shots near the end of the book. But like you said, some of it, like the dinner show and other elements, were originally going to be part of Galaxy's Edge. But I'm curious for you. I never visited. Were you ever able to go there? And, I'm curious just for any thoughts you have on it and maybe why it didn't do well.
Yeah. So I went once as a press visit right before it opens. And I was very fortunate for that because I think it was really cool. I think it's beautifully designed. For a while, I did not get but it's Star Trek until I saw Strange New Worlds, which I love. And it looks so much like that Enterprise, just coincidentally. I'm like, yeah, okay. And I had some really special moments. The food was phenomenal, I thought. But like that, I couldn't get over the price tag for even the specialness that it was for me. Like that felt so, and it's something like I feel frustrated with even, in Galaxy's Edge. I'm like, I've been to the Savi's Workshop show. Like I've been in once because my husband built a lightsaber. And that's because he wanted one. I'm like, I'm at I've become so choosy about collectibles because stuff takes up space
Yeah.
and I need to stop that I didn't have a desire to build a lightsaber. But without him doing that, I'm like, I wouldn't have seen that show. And I think it's unfortunate that things like that show is so beautiful. You can call it a show experience, but it's like, I feel like it's like gate kept because of the price, right? And that is kind of at Disney parks. Like I feel like so many things are just getting more pricey or that just more complicated and like, oh, but you can bypass it if you throw more money at it. I'm like, how much more money do you want from me? So I was very grateful to have gone on it as part of media. Yeah, so that's kind of I just got so hung up on the price tag. It was hard for me to live my Star Wars story, even though I wasn't even paying for it. um, I know my favorite times, a special moment that I kind of was like, yes, this kind of was one of those I get it moments is my husband and I were just chilling in the atrium between things, which was rare because it was busy. And one of the Sajas saw us and had us follow her into the climate simulator, the outdoors are where people who need to see the sky can go. And you use the force to move rocks. It's a very simple effect, I think, but so wonderful. And the performance of the Sasha and the performance of all the cast, I don't knock the cast. That was A plus service, A plus performances. And the way she interacted with me and built up to that moment of me moving the rocks with the force was so beautiful that I cried. And I am an easy cry, admittedly. But and that was something though that just kind of randomly happened, right? Like I don't know how many people experienced that or saw that. Those kind of moments, like I was like, yes, this is I am very immersed. I am in it. I feel like this is special and no one else is getting this. And that was not that answered your question or not. I think the price tag is just was a lot for people to overcome.
Oh yeah, you definitely answered the question, I promise. But yeah, I understand about the price though, because for me, I have a 15-year-old and they are really into Star Wars, but we looked at how much it was going to cost and just went, yeah, we could technically afford it, but I just couldn't do it. And then like even
Yes.
I've never done Savis and I would love to do that. And like looking at the concepts in the book, I was like, because I mean, I haven't watched videos because I'm like, well, if I ever do it, I kind of want to be surprised. But I look at the art in the book and I'm like, does it really look like that? Because that looks so much better than I would have guessed. And same with droids or whatever else. It's just, yeah, I get it. They want to make it special and exclusive, but it's a lot. And I've watched videos of similar things with the Galactic Starcruiser where the actors look so amazing, and that makes me sad that more people didn't get to do it. Actually,
Yeah, I'm very curious what, if anything, will become of it and when they announce it, because it's there.
it's a building.
It is just waiting for something.
Well, I wanted to ask for your thoughts too about, we may at some point, maybe we'll get a third attraction at Galaxy's Edge because they did just announce, which I think is cool. We have a new Smuggler's Run mission coming in a few
Oh,
years.
that's right.
Yeah. Which I don't know if it's going to be in addition or replacing or what with Hondo or what, but with Mando and Grogu, I still feel like that landed so big. And like you said, they could add a third attraction pretty easily. Like what, as a Star Wars fan, what would you want to see if they did something like that?
Look, I know it is not practical, probably. I don't know how they would do it, but in the concepts where there was like, because I wrote a children's book, Ellie and Me. I
Right.
worked very closely with Scott and Margaret on that to get like kind of what they had in mind for Ellie. And I think one of the concepts, was she was going to be like a life size walk around, potentially like people could ride her. And I'm like, I would, which that was a huge nerd moment because I got to name the creature type. She's a theory. I'm like, you would have to tear me off of that animatronic creature or whatever it is. And it's hard to like, I really like Star Tours doesn't make sense there, but I still like, I love Star Tours. And I guess Smuggler's Run is kind of like a motion simulator in a similar way, but that doesn't really answer your question. It would be Ellie. It would be riding around a theory.
Well, no, I'll jump on Star Tours because I also, when people say, "Oh, they should get rid of it" or something, I'm like, no,
Oh,
because I think
don't,
it's, I
don't you
almost,
dare.
I mean, yes, Rise of the Resistance is so much more advanced and so cool, and Smuggler's Run is fun. Well, my daughter and I got to be pilots, and I was like, oh, now I get it more. But the fact that they just added Ahsoka and Andor and all that, and they keep adding to it with the new shows, because for a while they didn't add to it. They just had like this. I would always go to Naboo
Since the
every time.
movies, right? Yeah.
Yeah, but now they added like the sequels, and they had the one with all the Star Destroyers from Rise of Skywalker. But the one where you go through Last Jedi on the Red Planet is really cool. There's just a lot of cool stuff. So I agree with you. I hope that stays because I think it's been cool how they've updated it.
I agree. And that's one of I was, like I said, I'm choosy about collectibles and I did get it. But for D23 this year, they did like a Star Speeder that was scaled for 3 3/4 figures and you could like strap them in. And I don't think I've ever been that sad about losing out on until I was like, oh, because it was, of course, limited edition. I'm like,
Right.
Disney, you could have sold so many of those. But sure, limit it to 3,000.
Yeah, I guess they wanted people to feel special, but I agree. I saw that and people were showing it and how it does all these little effects that are like they didn't have to do that. It's really
Oh,
cool.
it has the screen with scenes from the original ride. Like, oh, so yes. And of course, that is another reason why Star Tours has a special place in my heart because it is my first experience with Star Wars. But yeah, that is a like must ride for me when I'm at Disneyland or DHS.
Oh, for sure. Well, I want to make sure to ask you about a few of the other things you've done, other books, before we talk about Thrill Ride, of course. But you were able to contribute a story to a collection of stories from a certain point of view, The Empire Strikes Back, which I thought was really cool. I mean, yours was about like a PR person for the rebellion. So I'm curious to know a little bit about you developing a fictional story and getting to write something within a movie like Empire.
Yeah, if that's my favorite. I mean, that's not an original, like, that's my favorite Star Wars movie. And that was when I got asked about it. To that point, I'd only written nonfiction Star Wars. And I was like, I want to go back to time. I'm like, you are very, I mean, it's, and I know the editor, Tom and I go way back on Twitter and conventions, but I'm like, I normally write nonfiction. He's like, yeah, I know, but that's okay. And I'm like, oh, and he had kind of an idea, like we want to feature someone who is like on that first transport that leaves, and you can think about what you want it to be. And I'm like, great, I will kind of write what I know, and that she starts out as a reporter, but then turns propagandist, which I'm not familiar with being a propagandist, but a couple of things had set it up. One, I love Hunger Games, and later after they're trying to take down the Capitol and President Snow, like Katniss works with a propagandist team. And so that was part of my inspiration. And then also in Alphabet Squadron, I think, by Alexander Freed, there are references to Imperial propaganda, like we know about, like comes up in a few different things. There's even a whole book, it might be called Propaganda, I don't remember, that references that. But it's also like the rebellion's trying to recruit too. So I wanted a story that was kind of about an everyday person realizing, like, I need to talk to the big heroes. I need to talk to Luke, Leia, and Han. This is a couple of years, like everybody after Battle of Yavin is like, oh, these are I need to leverage this and use these people who helped destroy the Death Star and make it a whole thing. But then realizing, like, no, it's everyday people who join the rebellion. Like, they matter just as much. Anyone can make a difference. I love that story. And I've loved seeing that in Andor. That really gets to, like, what I love about Star Wars, which is hope, and that any person can contribute to making the world or galaxy a better place. And then I got to, like, write a line of dialogue for Han Solo, and that was like, I'm good now. And if I never write Star Wars fiction again, which I don't know that I will, I'm good. This was a great story to write, and within my favorite movie, and so yeah, that was. And then it was like the editor was great to work with. I'm like, this is great. This is the first fiction I've written since college. Thank you.
Well, I'm going to stick with Star Wars. I do want to ask you about the MCU book, but I feel like I have a few Star Wars questions to ask you here too before we veer into other things. So I'm curious for you. I feel like this is tough to wade into even, but The Acolyte. Unfortunately, I was very sad to see it canceled because I feel like it was really building towards something cool. But you even referenced Propaganda, and I feel like that show, not with Propaganda, but that show, along with Andor and some recent seasons of Mandalorian, kind of questioned like the rebellion and some of the things they did, and made it a lot, or even, this going back to the High Republic, but the idea that the Jedi are perfect and that idea. So I'm curious, for your thoughts just on that show, but even on, I don't know, I feel like it got kind of a raw deal a little bit.
Yes. And I feel like that happens, just with streaming in general, that things are not given time to grow and flourish. Like, I think a recent show, Willow, is a great example.
Oh, yeah.
I loved that show. So, I mean, I went out, I liked the movie always, but Willow is why I went and got like Elora Danin's like chosen one mark as a tattoo. And then like a day later, it was like, and it's canceled. And I'm like, how dare you?
And it's gone on. It's not on Disney Plus anymore.
It's gone. And I forget that. Just like last week, I was talking about Willow. I'm like, man, I really want to rewatch that. Somebody's like, you can't. And I'm like, oh my gosh, that's right. I can't.
They had a really cool behind the scenes thing for Willow too. Like one of those kind of like the Assemble documentaries. And
yes.
I thought that was cool too.
I agree. And like Neil Scanlon talked about like Creature Shop coming out and crushing it. And just recently too, like My Lady Jane was a show I like, Dead Boy Detectives, like all within the past like few weeks. And I'm just like, why can't we just give shows a second to find their fandom and to find their way? You can only do so much in 8 episodes. So I like the concepts it was exploring. I think I did have a moment, where I'm like, okay, so we learned kind of in the prequels, not that the Jedi were bad, but they definitely had some hubris issues, right? And they're like really attached to their dogma. And I'm like, And apparently that was still the case back then. And then make sure I'm like, were the Jedi ever good? So I'm using quotes that no one can see. But I like the exploration of that. I like questioning like kind of like, our basically Knights of the Round Table. That's how I kind of thought these people who you think are pure and good and noble, that they're flawed. They are humans, aliens who are, they are us. We are them. So I like that exploration, and I thought it was very dramatic in The Acolyte. And I think it needed more time, even if the first season would have had, because there are elements I really liked. I think there's some elements where we're only having 8 episodes that I'm like,
Right.
what were you doing with this episode? Could we have had like a little, like, can we
Mhm.
just like hurry things up a little bit? I think it meandered a little bit, but I think it just didn't have time. And I think that the heartbreaking thing about it is, I mean, many, but that because certain parts of the fandom were, misogynistic and racist and
Mhm.
loud about it, that it's not like Disney's being like, yes, we are rewarding you for this, but then it feels like that.
Mhm.
And that's not a reason like to not like to keep it going, right? Just despite that those people, but also like just give us time. What if we did that?
Yeah, I know, and it's too bad because, like you said, I mean, there was a whole episode that was a flashback that I was like, "Did we need the whole episode?"
Oh yeah.
I think it was even the second
Yes.
last episode again kinda did that.
I know. And I'm like, don't we have things to
So it wasn't perfect, but I feel like it deserved a little more time.
and again, I feel like I mean, Ahsoka wasn't perfect. Do I really enjoy it? Yes, but I can admit things like I was gonna say Book of Boba Fett, but we haven't heard about a season 2 of that either. But I feel like that was in my head, I never thought of that
Mhm.
as more than I don't know if that's me putting it on that. I'm like, I just kind of thought it was a limited series, and I don't know if that was ever said. But yeah, it's okay for things to be imperfect. Like, and give them time. And certainly other things that have not been perfect are still going on. So
I didn't mean to wade into anything to, get too controversial. I just thought I had to ask because it just happened literally like 3 weeks ago, 4 weeks ago. Like,
yeah, it was just
you know.
the cancellation came, I know, while I was at a writing retreat like the week before last. So it's very recent.
Yeah, time kind of moves weirdly for me. So I'm like, it could have been 6 months ago. It could have been last week. I'm not sure.
That is so relatable.
So I want to ask one more Star Wars question because I believe you're quite a fan of the expanded universe. Now many are called legends, some are canon, and I admit I have not read as many. I remember reading the original Thrawn series and Jedi Academy, and
Yeah.
then just kind of didn't read as much. So I've read a few. If like for someone like me, not just for me, this is not just for me. What are some of the like legends books or books that you're like read that one? It's awesome.
Yeah, so it is a wide world of books, and it is hard to keep up with. I am trying to be very transparent and especially once you put the comics into, which are fantastic, but I usually wait for those to build up to maybe an arc is done, definitely until it's in trade paperback form, because it's just more then I can mark it off on Goodreads that I read a book, and that's very satisfying to me. But if we're looking at Legends, a Thrawn trilogy classic, must read it. And now, even if it's Legends, right, a lot of like relevant bits of that are being pulled in, have been pulled into canon. If that's something you're concerned with, I personally think a good story is a good
Oh
story.
yeah.
And the difference between it being Legends and part of the current storytelling universe is that maybe it engages with something else you like. That's usually where I start is when somebody's like, where do I start? I'm like, great, tell me. It's so broad, right? I think Thrawn trilogy I recommend regardless. There's also a small trilogy of Han solo adventure books that are pretty brief, that are just ridiculous and fun. But when it comes to the current storytelling universe, I usually ask a person like, what do you like about Star Wars? If you like building of rebellion and that kind of stuff, like read the young adult Leia book, that Princess of Alderaan. Read Rebel Rising, which is Jyn Erso's backstory and has a lot about her family in it. Or if you're like, I really am so curious about, I love getting into Imperial story and why people do that. Read Fallen Stars. Read books that I'm forgetting the name of. The Inferno Squadron. Yes, I'm like the video game tie-in one. So that's how I usually start, which is not helpful for your question because it is there's such a wide variety
Sure.
that I like to personalize because I don't want to be like, you must read this one. And you're like, yeah, that sucked. But I like a Han, if you want a great, like, Han Lando, like caper nonsense, like Last Shot by DJ Older. Total blast. And
I
there's
have
like
read
an
that one. I read that one.
yes, yes. And
It's
I'm like,
great.
plus you get an Ewok slicer who is sassy and wonderful. So it's really, and that's not helpful, but yeah, it's really so personal because there are so many.
So many. It's almost overwhelming. I'm like, I need to go back and read some. Like, I don't know. But no, I wasn't trying to quiz you. I promise
Oh no, of course
no one
not.
will come to you and say, hey, I didn't like that one you told me to read. I promise. I just
Like,
had to
how
give you
dare
thoughts.
you?
How dare you
Yeah.
mention that? Well, real quick, I wanted to ask you, we've talked all Star Wars basically, but I know you were involved with speaking of books that seem like a massive undertaking, which I know was a group, the Marvel Cinematic Universe, an official timeline, which I looked through it and I'm like, man, they could have done a book just about Eternals and the timeline because there's so much, but there's just so much there. So I'm curious what your involvement was in that and then what it was like to kind of work on that.
Yeah, what a heap of a book when I got my author copy. I'm like, I'd seen the PDF, right? And I knew it was many pages, but then I got the copy and I'm like, that is hefty. And it was like, so I wrote it with Anthony Breznican and Rebecca Theodore-Vachon. And Anthony did like, we all did a fair bit, but Anthony, I would say, did the heavy lifting for as far as like Rebecca and I split up like the kind of design spread pages that are like Iron Man's armor. What else did I do? Captain America's shield, while Loki and Thor, like kind of like the more character and prop and location specifics. And Anthony kind of wrote the everything else. So I know he had more of the time of going back and forth with our editor at DK Publishing and Marvel to sort like those nitty gritty questions. And Anthony went through and watched everything again. And anytime there was a mention of a date or picture of like a newspaper or any like, or there's a TV in the background and maybe like the news is happening and maybe there's a date. Like him and David, the editor Fentiman, did a lot of that like work of we've written all this down. Now let's work together and work with Marvel to see if it makes sense. And if not, they use the really smart, like Loki came along at the right time because throughout the book, like if there's been discrepancies, right? Like MCU's a lot.
Oh yeah.
And it's a lot of dates to keep track of. And they were aware of that. So they used missed minutes to kind of call out like bumps in the timeline. So that's throughout the book. And then, so bless them for that. And then I got the joy of like, oh yeah, I don't really remember the Battle of Sokovia that much, so I'm just gonna sit down and rewatch that specific scene. Or the danger of any kind of book like this is you're like, I'm gonna sit down and rewatch the specific moment. 2 hours later, I have watched the whole movie again. But it was a beast, and it was a lot of spreadsheets and tracking, and Rebecca was very like, I feel like that was the second project I work on with multiple authors where everyone is just like, for the most part, we're like, oh, like you take this and I'll take this. And I don't remember if we had any ones where like, I need to write about XYZ. I think I might have done that with Gamora and Nebula. So yeah, and it was beautiful to watch it come together. And that was a project, like huge respect to David Finneman at DK Publishing for masterminding that because goodness.
Yeah, I mean, just looking at it, it was like, I mean, I've seen all the movies and the shows and stuff, but I wouldn't say like if there was a discrepancy, there's so much information I wouldn't know. But I appreciate, I'm like, they went beyond what I figured when I saw MCU timeline they would do. Well, I'm curious, we've been asking about Star Wars. I mean, Marvel is kind of regrouped a lot and now they're kind of going, I mean, shifting things, obviously some reason because of Kang and everything, but also just popularity and whatever. But what is there something coming up that you're kind of interested or excited about with Marvel, which I know is a big question because they have like 50,000 things coming up.
Yeah, but no, if you would have asked me that 6 months ago, I mean, it's only been Deadpool and Wolverine for a while, which I thought was really fun, but of like kind of what they've reimagined or reprioritized, like Fantastic Four, I am very into that cast. I am very into kind of seeming like it's going to be a period piece.
Yeah.
I'm really not sure about Doom cast. I don't know. I thought the Doom casting is I really like Robert Downey Jr., but I'm curious. I don't know how I'm trying to remain open-minded just because I'm like, there are other actors that, okay. But he's great also at the same time. Like Iron Man's probably, I think, the Marvel movie I rewatched the most, that and Thor Ragnarok.
Mm-hmm.
But like when I'm like, yes, Fantastic Four is it for me.
Yeah, when they had that, I forget if it was Comic Con. I think it was Comic Con where they had that weird like '60s flying car come through,
Yeah.
and I was like, oh, I bet because I remember like X-Men First Class where they were like the period stuff I really enjoyed. So I'm like, oh, I think I need a period piece here. This is good.
And I feel like they haven't had one really since, has it been since First Avenger? Is that true? Oh, I guess, I mean, Captain Marvel was
Right.
like the 90s is a
Sort of.
period piece. Yeah. I'm like, that just makes me feel old. So I don't like to
They had a
think
Blockbuster
that.
video. It was like, oh, it's so old.
Oh, I'm like, oh, I used to do that on Friday nights. Fine.
Well, excellent. Well, I want to finish by asking you about your upcoming book, which I mentioned in the intro that's very exciting, Thrill Ride, which I admit I wouldn't say I'm the biggest rom-com fan ever, but I like the idea of it being set in like a small town theme park. So I'd love to hear, how you got interested in doing this and then kind of a little bit you can reveal about the book.
Yeah. So writing that short story for From a Certain Point of View, The Empire Strikes Back gave me the fiction writing itch. I was like, oh, making things up is challenging, but it's fun. And I love reading romance. It's such an escape for me. And the beautiful thing about the romance genre, if people don't know, is that part of it is a happy ending. It's a happy HEA, happy ever after, or happy for now. And like I love picking up a book and knowing that, yeah, I might go through some stuff. It might be like a roller coaster, not intended, but I will put this down and I will be satisfied. Like it's not going to end in a tragedy. And the world is a lot. And I don't always need that from fiction. So I went on in June 2021. I went to a press event for Velocicoaster at Universal Studios Florida. And as I've said, I'm not a roller coaster person, but I was in my I'm going to try new things phase. Like, it's after the pandemic. I am vaccinated. This is my first time. I think that was my first time back at a theme park. I want to do my job well. And I went on it and I will never do it again. Beautiful roller coaster. But I remember like right after I got off of it, I went to like go do my interview with the art director. I was like, I don't normally go on roller coasters. And he just looked at me. He's like, are you okay? And I'm like, do I look really pale? Like, I'm not actually. He's like, do you want to sit down? I'm like, yes, I do want to sit down. That is an intense. But around that time, I think it was that even like that moment, it's like the first opening chapter is roller coaster moment for someone who thinks it's a great time, which more respect to you if you think that's a great time. I think of as the time in which I am trying not to throw up. And I started thinking about it like I love a small town romance. That's kind of a trope in romance novels. And I love an idealized small town. I'm from Southern Ohio, from a small town that I couldn't wait to leave. So I think it's kind of like, what if I could live like these ones in romance novels, like Stars Hollow, right? And Gilmore Girls. Gosh, sounds like that sound so charming. And I kind of went about looking for some theme park inspiration because I knew I wanted it to be a family owned and not like super big and not really have like IP in it. And I found Enchanted Forest in Portland, Oregon. And I haven't been yet and I really want to go, but I got hardcore into research. They published a lovely book about the history of the park, and it's this homegrown park built by Roger Toft, who was just his dream to build a theme park. And he acquired lands and he did that. So I kind of modeled the idea of having the smaller family run theme park on Enchanted Forest, just the idea of it. And I did, Imagineering in a Box, like the program they have for
Right,
kids
yeah.
that's free online. I did that to kind of help. I didn't like build it or anything, but it helped me with theming. So the theme park is called Lands of Legend. It's very based in kind of like mythology and legend. So there's a Forgotten Beasts land that has like a roller coaster called Hydra's Fury that has like two fighting tracks that are like when you cut off the Hydra's head, like another track spits off, and when you cut off another one, it spits you back onto the other track. So it feels like, so I got really in the weeds with building a theme park, land and theming and ride details, probably, 80%, which is not in the book. But it made me really happy to build a theme park, and to build it right with, I don't have to have a budget. I'm just putting this on the paper, on pieces of paper. I just word so I can build whatever I want, even though I had to kind of be mindful, like, right, like what would this small town theme park? Like, what could it reasonably build? So the story is my main character, Charlotte, is a former dream mechanic, not Imagineer, because we don't like to be
Of
sued.
course not.
Of course not. So that was kind of fun too. I'm like, I think Disney Parks fans will be like, "Oh yeah, that's what you renamed Indiana Jones Adventures." And I'd be like, "Yes, it is." And they'll also be like, she goes to the company she works for is Dream Us, and they have Dreamland in Florida, and I definitely brought some elements of Disneyland to my version of the Magic Kingdom, basically, because I love them, and I don't. People realize if anyone reads it, it's like, excuse me, that park does not actually exist at Magic Kingdom. Like, I know. I just really love some Disneyland elements, and I needed the park to be in Florida for story reasons, for a field trip. But this park in Southern Ohio, it's owned by Charlotte's aunt and uncle, and they've been trying to open this fourth area with their like first like big roller coaster that looks like it's going underwater for a while, and they keep getting so close, but they just don't have the money. So they start working with an investor, and his name's Gregory, and he's never been on a roller coaster, like doesn't know the difference between a theme park and amusement park. And Charlotte, she's been laid off from Dream Mechanics and is living at home and helping with the park anyway. And she kind of has to show him the ropes. And at first, she's just super annoyed with him, right? Because he's wearing a suit to a theme park and just doesn't know anything. But they spend a lot of time together. Hijinks ensue and they fall in love. But it was really fun to build the theme park, and they spend a lot of time in it. And I also love when books have places like where the setting as a character. And I really wanted to indulge in that with Lands of Legend. And I really wish I could visit there now. So if a really ultra wealthy person can read the book and then build that theme park, that would be cool. We can have talks.
I would love that. Yeah. I mean, right away you start. I mean, I Enchanted Forest I've never been to, but I have seen videos of, and that place is something. I would love to go there. But if it has any vibes like that, I think it's perfect. It sounds really interesting. And yes, happy endings. I know I mentioned about rom-coms, but happy endings in our current world is great. That's great. I give a thumbs up for that, because that's always fun. And am I correct? It's supposed to come out next March.
Yes, it is out, I believe, on March 20. I should know this, but it's out on March 29th, I believe, very end of March 2025. And it's a 2-book deal. So there will be a sequel set in the same world. And I'm pretty sure the main character is her best friend. The second book, who's a theme park food blogger, which I cannot wait to do the research for that.
Oh, yes, yes. Well, Amy, you're doing so many cool things. I really enjoy your Roads Go Ever on newsletter, and involved in lots of books. So if someone's like listened to all this and wants to check out your work or connect with you, is there certain places that they should go?
Yes, you can kind of see all of my books that are out at amyratcliffe.com and go to the books page, and I'll have links there. Like if you want signed copies or anything, I always work with my local indie bookstore, Malaprops in Asheville, to do that. You can subscribe to my newsletter at amyratcliffe.substack.com. And then the social media I use the most is Instagram, and it's Amy_geek. And I'm pretty responsive to DMs on there.
Well, that's awesome. Well, Amy, this has been great. I really enjoyed the Galaxy's Edge book and a lot of your other books. I mean, we only covered, just for the listener's sake, we only covered a small percentage of some of the books and you've participated in or written. So this has been great. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dan. This was delightful.
Just want to give a big thanks to Amy for being on the show and being such a fun guest. If you haven't checked out The Art of Star Wars Galaxy's Edge, like maybe you think it's more like promotional and just includes the typical concept art that we've already seen, like the Disney Parks blog and everything else, it's a lot more than that. I'm still kind of amazed that Walt Disney Imagineering released so much concept art, particularly a lot of it about attractions that never happened. It's really interesting to dig through. I promise if you get it, you're going to blink and hours have passed. Speaking of hours, there are 241 past episodes of the Tomorrow Society podcast, including a lot with authors and former Imagineers, other really fun experts, and I've done some trip reports. I promise there's something for everyone. Go to tomorrowsociety.com/podcast to learn more, or you can just look back in your past Spotify or Overcast or Apple Podcast or whatever you use. I also wanted to highlight my episodes with Brian J. Jones. If you're into Star Wars, one, we talked about his biography of George Lucas, but we also dug into early seasons of The Mandalorian and some of the other Disney Plus shows. So those are a lot of fun to look back at. You can find all that wherever you listen to podcasts. Also wanted to give a big shout out to members of the Tomorrow Society through Patreon, Andy, Jim Ziegler, and Scott Trewick. You guys have been supporting the show for so long, since late 2019 and early 2020. Thank you so much for helping to keep this show going. If you are interested in helping out the show, it really makes a difference. We don't have ads, we don't have weird mid-roll cuts or sponsors or anything. How I keep this show going is through the support of listeners like you. Go to patreon.com/Tomorrow Society. You can also find out about some fun perks, including bonus episodes that you receive for a small monthly contribution. Or you can just say, hey, Dan, the next time you go to the parks, I want to buy you a Dole Whip or a coffee or whatever. Go to tomorrowsociety.com/Dole Whip to learn more. There, the music that you are hearing right now was written by Adam Hookey and performed by the Sophisticated Babies. Thank you all so much for listening to this episode with Amy Ratcliffe. I really enjoyed it. I hope you did too. Would love to hear what you think of it. You can always email me, dan@tomorrowsociety.com, or reach out through all the different social media. Just search for Tomorrow Society. Let me know what you think, and I will talk to you again very soon.